1 minute of silence cost the city hundreds of voices. When the librarian decided not to wake a visitor, the doors to knowledge slammed shut for everyone. Quiet hour. Evening settled over the city in heavy gray light, and the library resembled a ship slowly sinking into darkness. The large windows reflected the street lamps, while inside reigned the familiar silence, thick, viscous, as if it could be cut with a knife. Helen, the duty librarian, was making her final round through the hall. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. The books stood in even rows like soldiers on parade. At the far wall, by the reading desk, she noticed a man, middle-aged, in a gray jacket. He sat hunched over an open volume, motionless. Helen came closer. His eyes were closed, his breathing calm and steady. He had simply fallen asleep. On the table lay a crumpled, empty packet of glucose tablets, which he had apparently forgotten to throw away. The vending machine by the exit blinked red, card payment only, with a small paper note taped beside it, cash not accepted. The man's hand twitched slightly, fingers trembling, but it looked more like ordinary exhaustion. Helen glanced up. Right above him hung a laminated sign, "Please do not sleep." Ironically, it was half covered by a book with the loud title, "Workplace Hygiene." The situation looked so absurd that Helen allowed herself a faint smile. She paused, her hand resting on the back of his chair. The usual thought flickered. Wake him, remind them they were closing, politely escort him out. But nearby the clock ticked, the hands approaching the long-awaited end of her shift. Not my problem. He'll manage himself, Helen decided, and moved on. She turned off half the lamps, closed the registers with a practiced motion. The key clicked in the door lock as the clock hands passed 9. For a second, her eyes returned to the figure at the desk, barely visible in the dusk. The man didn't stir. Outside, Helen raised her coat collar and breathed in the damp air. Behind her, the library building loomed like a fortress. The night silence muffled her thoughts, leaving only the faintest doubt deep inside. The kind a person usually brushes aside, not to linger on trifles. The city carried on with its night, indifferent to the fact that one closed door could mark the beginning of a chain of events no one had foreseen. Morning began with a sharp shriek of a siren. The red lamp above the library's entrance flashed, reflecting off the glass doors. Security guard Carson, a heavy-set man with a weary face, cursed under his breath. That damn censor again. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, flashlight beam cutting the corridor. Behind him came his partner, young and tense, like a rookie on patrol. The air inside smelled of old paper and cheap cleaner. Everything seemed normal. Shelves, tables, neatly stacked chairs. But at the far window, the beam of light caught a silhouette. A man, hunched, motionless. "Hey!" Carson called, stepping closer. "Library's closed." No response. The man sat with his head slumped forward. When Carson touched his shoulder, the body sagged limply. Panic flashed across both faces. The younger guard was already dialing 911, while Carson muttered stubbornly, "This is what's the word?" "Just call, don't play doctor," snapped his partner, covering the phone. "Hypoglycemia, got it?" On the table lay the empty plastic pill packet and a crumpled napkin. The skin was pale, lips tinged blue. His breathing was barely perceptible.
A quick glucose check by the paramedic confirmed the numbers, low enough to draw a grim frown. 3 points something. That's practically zero. He's hanging on by a thread. The ambulance came fast. In the harsh white glare of the stretcher, the man looked fragile, like a dried shell. The paramedics worked efficiently, without excess words. Catheter, IV, blood sugar check again. One of them muttered in a flat tone, as if quoting a manual. If someone had given him juice or gel last night, he'd be walking home now. Time seemed to slow until the siren carried the stretcher away toward the hospital. The guards remained among the silence and the blinking lights. On the table, where the man had read the night before, lay an open book. Beside it, a small juice box, unopened, forgotten. Carson glanced at it, but said nothing. And it was that invisible detail that stayed in memory longer than the siren's wail. By 9 in the morning, the offices of the city's Department of Culture were already thick with the smell of coffee and paper. Gray suits, tablets, folders with emblems, all merged into the monotonous ritual of authority. At the center of the long table sat Mr. Lambert, director of the library network, a man with the face of an eternal diplomat, a smile present but no joy behind it. On the screen, surveillance footage. The man falling asleep at the desk, the librarian turning off the lights, leaving. Darkness. Then the morning chaos. Guards, ambulance, stretcher. An awkward silence filled the room. "So," said one official, thin and nervous, with a golden tie pin, "a man spends the night in your building, and no one checks the hall before closing?" Lambert adjusted his glasses. "Protocol requires an inspection. The duty librarian insists she made one. Apparently, she did not notice." The words "did not notice" sounded like a verdict. Papers rustled. One by one, officials fired off questions, competing to pin blame. "We don't close libraries, we optimize access. By the way, print me this cloud report on paper." A cough triggered muffled laughter around the table. Helen was summoned the same day. She sat opposite the commission, hands calmly folded on her knees. Voices droned around her, blending into a stream of accusatory phrasing. She tried to explain. "I thought he had simply fallen asleep. I didn't want to disturb him." The thin official interrupted. "Excuse me, what do you mean, didn't want to disturb him?" "Well, I assumed he'd rest a bit, then leave on his own," Helen answered. "But you locked the building." "I did," she nodded. That short exchange was louder than any report. In the protocol, her words became a dry line. "Employee failed to remove visitor." Lambert closed the folder and said gently, almost apologetically, "Understand, Miss Helen, this is no longer just your mistake. It's the system's." And at that moment it was clear. The conversation was over, but the reckoning had only begun. The man's family did not wait for internal reviews. Within a week, the local newspapers printed the headline, "Man spends night in library, ends up in intensive care." The next day, a negligence lawsuit was filed. News segments briefly clarified, "Patient stable in ICU." Court hearings turned into a spectacle, but the main story played out elsewhere, in captions and footage, trial scenes, flashing cameras, newspaper headlines, a commentator's flat voiceover. "Case of library negligence. City at the center of scandal."
It looked like just another episode in a long series of civic crises. On the streets, though, the story felt different. A boy of 13 sat outside the locked library doors with a tablet, pressing it against the glass to catch scraps of Wi-Fi. His friend urged, "Let's go to McDonald's, the internet's faster." The boy shrugged, but here it was free. An elderly woman in an old coat came clutching a ring of keys. She told a reporter, "I had a reader's key from the old director. It should open." When the lock refused, she sighed heavily. So now the books aren't ours either. A young mother pushed a stroller, explaining to a journalist, "I came here to read stories to my child. At home it's cramped. The neighbor yells, 'Where do I read him now?'" These scenes never made it into official reports, but they showed the price of error more clearly than any court ruling. On a neon-lit talk show, an official declared confidently into the camera, "We haven't closed libraries. We've entered a new era of optimization." The host frowned, dryly clarifying, "So the library is closed?" "Well, formally, yes." Laughter erupted in the studio before the feed cut to commercials. In the Department of Culture's hallway, Lambert handed in his badge and clutched a folder of personal belongings. His departure looked ordinary, but everyone understood the story was far from over. The price of the mistake wasn't just lawsuits. It showed itself in a teenager with a tablet, a woman with a stroller, an old lady with useless keys. The city was losing its libraries, and with them, the voice of itself. The reform seeped in quietly, like a leak in an old pipe. At first, the notice read, "Libraries will now close at 7 p.m." A trifle. Weeks later, signs changed again, 5 p.m. Soon, Saturday shifts disappeared altogether. Outside the main branch, two elderly men in caps argued loudly for all to hear. "Under the old mayor, they closed at 10 with music," one insisted. "What music?" the other snorted. "Well, maybe not music, but definitely later than now." Teenagers sat on the steps with laptops on their knees. Screens blinked, connections appeared and vanished. "Got it! Signal's up!" one grinned. The other dropped his tablet and swore softly. A journalist's camera caught the shot. Boys clinging to weak Wi-Fi through closed walls. Nearby, a young man in a cheap suit fought with an online resume form. "Upload PDF," the button froze. He slammed his fist on his knee and told a local TV crew, "I used to apply for jobs at midnight. Now what? My home internet cuts every 5 minutes." Official reports phrased it differently. Saved 18 minutes on cleaning schedules, lost 1,800 reader hours monthly. The arithmetic looked comical against the human scenes outside the doors. Helen observed it all as if through glass. She went to work and saw empty halls where even the air felt unnecessary. Shelves remained full, yet unwanted. One day, Anna, standing by the encyclopedias, said, "We've turned into a museum of living exhibits, only we haven't been written off yet." Her words hung heavy in the air, and the library truly resembled a museum, without visitors, with empty halls, and guards instead of keepers of knowledge. Helen sat in the archive, dim lamps buzzing above rows of folders. The smell of dust and cardboard thickened the air, as if time slowed here. On the chair beside her lay a pile of discarded books, destined for disposal after the fund optimization. Even paper seemed superfluous in a city that chose to economize on memory. Behind a thin partition, a staff training called Empathy 101 was underway. A cheerful coach instructed, "Smile, listen, nod. People love attention." At that moment, a worker passed by carrying a box labeled "Discarded." Encyclopedias and novels stuck out from inside, unwanted by anyone. The contrast was so cruel that Helen's breath caught. Anna entered quietly with a coffee mug. They exchanged tired looks. The conversation began with routine matters, cutbacks, new instructions, visitor complaints. Gradually, it circled toward the core. "You do understand," Anna said. "It all started that evening with that decision." Helen stayed silent. The image returned. The man at the desk, closed eyes, her steps toward the door. She slowly ran her hand along the back of that same chair, as if erasing the trace of her choice. "I thought I was being kind, that you shouldn't disturb someone if he's tired," she whispered. Anna paused, then replied evenly, almost in a whisper. "Kindness and indifference stand side by side. Sometimes they're hard to tell apart." The words cut deeper than any official accusation. Helen realized that the decision made almost automatically had been the trigger. The city fired directors, shortened hours, dimmed lamps and reading rooms, but the root remained here, in her hand that never touched the shoulder of the sleeping man. That evening, she stepped onto the library porch. The building stood as an empty shell in twilight. Helen looked at the dark windows and understood. Conscience is not closed with the doors. It remains, quiet, sharp, unyielding. Night draped the city like a heavy blanket. The library stood in darkness, only the occasional glow of a street lamp catching its massive doors. The metal grille reflected the light, resembling a cage locked not just for people, but for the very idea of knowledge. Helen stopped across the street. Her shift had ended long ago, but she returned as if drawn by an inner pull. She gazed at the dark windows, remembering when these walls had held quiet life, the rustle of pages, children's laughter at computers, elderly debates over newspaper clippings. All gone now. The man, the last visitor, had survived. He now walked with a cane, slow and cautious, as if every step were a new lesson. His family continued the lawsuit, not for money, but out of principle, as though the process itself mattered more than the outcome. One day, he returned to the library. At the return desk, leaning on his cane, he handed over a book. His face bore a grateful smile, as if to say, "Thank you for calling the ambulance that night." The clerk scanned the barcode automatically, and the machine printed a slip. Overdue, 0 days, branch closed. The receipt looked like a joke, except no one laughed. The man folded the paper carefully into his pocket and left, the cane tapping softly on the tiles. Helen saw it from a distance and knew no document, no court ruling would undo what had happened, and no receipt would erase its consequences. She touched the metal grille, then withdrew her hand. The door remained closed, a monument to her choice.